I am delighted to have journalist, author, motivational speaker and broadcaster Matthew Syed joining us today. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you, Alice. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the chat.
Good. Well, for today's conversation, we'll be delving into two of your books, Black Box Thinking, the inside story of how success really happens, and Rebel Ideas, which examines the power of diverse thinking. So let's start with Rebel Ideas, if I may. The fact of the matter is, we are attracted to people who think like us. Why can this be a challenge when you're trying to solve complex problems?
Well, it's a great way that you frame the question, because there isn't a problem if the question that one is asking is a very simple one. You just need one mind, one perspective. It's more than enough to tackle a particularly simple problem, or a problem that's already been solved and one is just executing again in the same way and is trying to do so consistently. But many of the really interesting challenges that we face are complex, strategic questions, innovating, coming up with a new advertising campaign. And when it's a complex, multi-dimensional problem of the kind that businesses and governments face all the time, one perspective isn't enough. One brain isn't enough. That's why you get together with a team of people who can bring different perspectives, different pieces of information, different insights to help come up with a commanding, sensible strategy, solution, new idea. But as you say, the great irony is that we're attracted to people who think just like us, who share our perspectives. There's a warning down the centuries from Aristotle and Plato. They call it homophily. And so it takes a bit of discipline and a bit of courage to break out from these echo chambers, this tendency towards groupthink, to really come up with the best ideas.
Now, you mention echo chambers in your book. Can you, just for the in sort of layman terms, tell us what that is when we're thinking about organisations, and have you got any examples of what effect it can have on a team?
Well, I mean, the term emerged from the digital world, where there was the belief, and one of the intentions of the creation of the internet was that people would be able to reach out to different people with different perspectives, to challenge themselves, and therefore to come up with wiser solutions. And of course, what has actually happened, to an extent, is that people congregate towards people who think in a very similar way on politics and other things of that kind. So you've got a lot of diversity in the overall global network, but the local networks are all very homogeneous. This can happen in organizations too. And there are many classic examples. The one that I open Rebel Ideas with is the CIA, which has an incredibly poor track record since its inception after the Second World War of anticipating major threats. The Cuban Missile Crisis, they failed to anticipate the fall of the Soviet Union. The case study that I focus on is the build-up to 9/11. And the problem wasn't the individual intelligence of the analysts. The problem was that almost all of them were white, male, West Coast, Protestant, liberal arts graduates. There's nothing wrong with somebody who has those background tendencies at all. You need people who are different from one another in a team, and one of those may well be white, male, middle class, Protestant, liberal arts graduate from the West Coast. But when you have an entire institution from that background, it can narrow the capacity of the overall group to anticipate threats that are emerging from different societies through radicalization, extremism, and other things of that kind. So I think there is an acknowledgement now that the problem wasn't with any individual, but with their collective lack of intelligence.
So, as a leader of a team, how do I listen to fresh voices of contrasting opinion when my inner voice of experience is wanting to take centre stage?
That, I think, can be a problem. I mean, it's not, as I say, it's not a problem if the challenge is a very simple one. Then the leader can just say, right, this is what we're going to do, fall in behind me, let's get it done. I don't want to have any dissent. But if the leader isn't omniscient and doesn't have all of the relevant knowledge or all the relevant information, then it's really important to reach out. And in those circumstances, having a meeting or a forum where people can come up with different ideas without risking the wrath of the leader saying, how dare you say something different to me? I'm supposed to have all of the good ideas around here, acting defensively or punitively. That can shut down the expression of different views. So in addition to having diverse perspectives, people also need to have the capacity to express those perspectives. And a leader who creates a culture where people speak up, where you have that vigorous internal debate before coming to a decision. Of course, the leader can't outsource a decision, but is likely to make wiser decisions after hearing the honest views of the people in the team, rather than the people in the team saying what they think the leader wants to hear, which is a very different thing.
Okay, moving our attention to black box thinking for a moment. Admitting to our mistakes can compromise our self-esteem. So how can one change one's relationship with failure to make it a more fruitful one?
I think this is thank you. I mean, I think this is a real constraint, that we like to get things right. And of course, we want to get things right for our customers, for our colleagues. There's nothing wrong with that. But in a complex world, it's inevitable that any solution we come up with isn't going to be perfect, or is unlikely to be perfect. And therefore, the capacity to deconstruct the gap between what we really want to happen and what actually happened is crucial to closing that gap. So learning from mistakes, having systems that enable the open sharing of where things could have gone better, I think is a critical factor in continuous improvement. And some cultures are very bad at that. Some cultures are very good. And I think this is a huge differentiator between those that continuously improve and look for the opportunity to innovate, and those that shut that learning down.
Now, as a ex-professional sportsman, I should say, unless you're still professionally playing table tennis and I didn't know, you're a massive advocate of feedback. Can you share any recent examples where feedback significantly improved your performance, and critically or contrastingly, where you haven't sought feedback and wished you had?
Me personally?
You personally.
Oh. So in sport, one of the interesting things about sport is you get constant feedback, because if you hit the ball in a table tennis match and it doesn't go where you wanted it to go, you immediately know that you need to readjust your technique in the light of what you learned. So sport has this very tight feedback loop built into it that means that most people who play with some degree of concentration improve through time. I mean, the problem in many organizations is there isn't a feedback loop. There isn't a clear and precise signal of how we can get better. There's a certain amount of noise in the system. There's a few grey areas. So organizations that really have the intellectual honesty to seek and solicit that feedback do so much better. I can give you lots of case studies of that. In terms of my own development, I should say that having retired from sport, I'm now a retired ping pong player, although you really ought not to play ping pong. You get very offended by that. But in the broadcasting that I do, I once did a podcast on the BBC, 5 Live, with Fred Flintoff, a cricketer, and Robbie Savage, a footballer. And they actually taught me quite a lot about how disciplined you need to be to seek out feedback. Because, you know, Robbie, for example, isn't a natural broadcaster. But after our very first pilot, he's on the phone to me as I'm driving to Manchester Piccadilly Station to get the train back to London. What could we have done differently? What could we have done better? Who can we include in our WhatsApp group who can give us really honest feedback about what's working and what isn't? How can we reach out to other podcasts, see what they're doing and how it's working? Let's look at the data on them. He also reads every review on iTunes, every review on Twitter. This is a self-selecting group, of course, but it still gives you some really useful insights. And he acted as a kind of executive producer, constantly trying to harness whatever data there was so that we could do better for the people who were listening. And it was a real insight into how, you know, somebody who isn't necessarily a brilliant broadcaster could nevertheless be part of, I shouldn't really say he's a very good, Robbie, if you're listening, I think you're excellent, but how you can be part of a very successful podcast when you have that real determination to constantly learn.
Fantastic. Now, tell me about pre-mortems and the effectiveness of this kind of scenario planning.
Well, the pre-mortem is being used very effectively now in various organizations, in some national governments. It goes back to some of what we've already discussed, that when you have a particular plan or strategy and you have a conventional risk management analysis, it's very easy for people to fall in behind the plan. There's nothing wrong with that. They feel that that's a loyal thing to do, particularly if the plan is being proposed by the boss, whoever that might be. And so the risk isn't properly assessed. A pre-mortem is a very different meeting where everyone around the table has to imagine that the project has failed, the patient has died. By making it concrete, it changes the way people think about it. And they're then asked to generate plausible explanations for why the plan failed. And they're judged on the plausibility of those explanations. Suddenly you're generating great possible explanations of what went wrong. And that isn't to scupper the plan, by the way. It's to try and improve it before implementation. It's sometimes called, forgive me, we should have done a pre-mortem on me knocking my computer as I was trying to talk, and I'm getting so passionate about it with my hands. It's sometimes called prospective hindsight. And I think there are some circumstances, quite a few circumstances with big strategic plans, or even smaller ones, where this can have a big effect.
Could a pre-mortem have prevented COVID pandemic?
Well, that's a very interesting. So I certainly think that diversity of thought would have had a massive effect on the UK government's response, and I can perhaps come back to that. In terms of the pre-mortem, there were pre-mortems that were conducted on what a future pandemic might look like and the sorts of precautions we could take as a world to ensure that if a new virus emerged in a particular locality, we'd be able to put in circuit breakers to ensure that it didn't spread around what is now a very interconnected world. The problem was national governments didn't act upon this. I think there was a certain element of denial and short-termism. Interestingly, I think that will never happen again with regard to pandemics, but the next low probability, high impact event that hits the world will not be a pandemic, it will be something different. So we do need much better planning, and we need to act on what pre-mortems are telling us. But I do think, as we're talking, Alice, the National Statistical Office has just published the ranking list of deaths, excess deaths by nation, and England comes bottom. And I think, if we've got time, I think diversity of thought was a problem.
Right.
I kind of invited your next question,
haven't
I?
I haven't. I know, but I know we're pushed for time, so I'm trying to keep us going in certain directions. In terms of, I'm really interested in this, in terms of distinction in characteristics between winning and losing businesses post-COVID, will there be any, do you think?
Well, I definitely think that adaptability is going to be very important. I should say that the first week after the emergence of this virus, I think a lot of the C-suite chief executives and people that I was talking to were confused and anxious, and this is a perfectly natural response. I was nervous and anxious, and I'm sure you were, Alice, as well. But I would say after a week, there were clear differences between those who were beginning to think strategically about what do we need to do in order to ensure that we're in the best possible place given what has happened. And I know that some of the big tech companies were already looking at new information sharing platforms. They were looking at the emerging psychological evidence about how to conduct meetings, virtual meetings, how to make sure they're effective, and a whole range of other subtle transformation, or how we reach out to clients. How do we conduct our relationships with clients in this new virtual world? How do we use data in a more effective way? So I do think there were, and others were just saying, you know what, we're sticking to what we've always done. It's an absolute nightmare. Let's hope it gets back to normal soon. But weren't thinking flexibly about what do we need to do in this reality. And I think that is fundamentally a psychological question.
Yeah. Now, what lessons, if any, has this pandemic afforded you? I'm thinking sort of just personally, you're a writer, broadcaster, author, excuse me, you're a family man. What lessons have you taken from this?
Well, we know each other very well personally, Alice. So I'm hoping your marriage to Harvey has been strengthened by this. I'm glad to say Kathy and I are still very solid. You're about to go to Norfolk. We've just come back. We've had a wonderful time. What else? What other personal reflections will I have on this period? I do think, in a funny kind of a way, it demonstrates some of the resilience of modern societies, to have been hit by this, to have been asked quite difficult questions by national governments during lockdown. There were obviously some people who didn't follow the rules, and there has been some international variation, but I do think it did hint at the resilience of modern society. I think there are some optimistic things we can take from this. I also think that, as I say, certain parts of the economy, I think, have responded extremely well. Some of the supply chains that people thought would break down have held up well. I think there are lessons for how we think about the resilience as opposed to the optimization of supply chains. But I think there are some positive things. But personally, it's been a tough period, but got through it, getting through it. It's not over yet.
And of course, you've recently completed your latest children's book, My Awesome Guide to Getting Good at Stuff. How much did you draw on your own experience as a father in that book?
Yeah, so this is actually, funnily enough, the Awesome Guide, that was part of World Book Day, but I have a new one coming out in September called Dare to Be You. So this is all about, you'll know this, that often kids, they want to follow the crowd. There's a strong sense of peer pressure to do what the group is doing. There's nothing wrong with that, but I do think that young people need to have the courage to occasionally say, you know what, my voice is telling me to do this, or I have an idea that doesn't fit into what people are thinking. And I think that individuality is going to be a really important part of the future. Fantastic. By the way, am I slowing down? Am I going in slow motion occasionally on your screen?
It's a funny one. Sometimes you're coming in and out. I don't know if it's just the connection or what, but I can hear you. So hopefully our listeners will be able to hear you too. Sadly, we're out of time, but thank you for your wisdom and insights, Matthew. Always so much to think about. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and have a fabulous holiday.
Thank you. Enjoy Norfolk.
I will do.
Make sure Harvey. I'm trying to think of a nice jibe at Harvey to finish this. Although people listening and they say, "Who is Harvey?" Harvey is Alice's husband and a brilliant former rugby player. So give my best to him. And I've enjoyed being part of this. I'm obviously looking forward to the upcoming event.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Matthew.
Thank you.